Chapter 1. The Fire Circle. Long before writing, before empires, before even villages had names, there was the fire. It didn't just warm our ancestors or cook their meat. It held the night still enough for memory to speak. And when the wind died down and the flames crackled low, they began to tell stories, because sleep came easier when you remembered who you were. If that idea makes your mind wander, you're in the right place. Before we begin, let us know in the comments from which country are you listening tonight. Your sleepy presence builds this little tribe of ours. And if you find rest here, don't forget to subscribe. Now imagine this. The sun has dipped behind the trees, leaving only the sharp outline of the tallest branches against a now purple sky. A group of tired feet shuffles back into camp, bare feet, hardened by years of walking across stone and thorn. There's no talking yet, only the crackle of sticks being arranged, the patient rubbing of flint against flint. You are one of them, cold, hungry, alive. At last, it catches. The first flame licks the darkness, and from that moment on, the day is over. The fire begins its second job, not to cook, but to hold you close, to warm your fingers, to light your thinking. This is where the very first bedtime stories were born, and none of them were written down. It's around 60,000 years ago, though no one knows that yet. No one counts years, no one even counts, but they do remember, not perfectly, and not everything, but enough to pass along the crucial bits. How to avoid the soft mud near the river's mouth, how to hide when the thunder beasts pass, and which mushrooms to touch only once. In this world, stories are not entertainment, they are survival, and more than that, they are comfort. The group is smaller than you might expect, maybe 10, maybe 12. A few children, an elder or two who haven't walked far in months. Tonight, no one is missing. That alone is worth humming about. A low hum begins, in fact a kind of rhythmic sighing that echoes from one throat to another. It's not music, it's older than that. It's the sound of people being together. And then someone speaks. Not in a language you'd understand, maybe not even a language yet, just sounds stitched together by repetition and meaning. But the voice carries weight. Everyone listens. What is said? You'll never know exactly, but it's something about the tree with the claw marks, and the child who once followed a glowing beetle too far, and how they found her cold but still alive, curled under the roots, dreaming. That story is told again every few nights, and every time it changes slightly. The fire helps. It always does. Firelight softens the face, makes shadows dance behind the speaker. It's hypnotic, especially when there's nothing else to do, no walls to paint, no fields to weed, no metal to sharpen, just the fire and the words. Across continents, this pattern repeats. In Africa, in the place now called Botswana, circles form around fires near termite hills. In ancient China, along the muddy banks of the Yangtze, figures gather around wood smoke and talk of river spirits. In South America, children trace shapes in the ashes, while their grandmothers speak softly of days when jaguars were gods. Everywhere, the story circle becomes an invisible structure, more permanent than stone. But how do we know these stories existed? Anthropologists and historians aren't mind readers, but they've studied patterns, language development, archaeological digs, even the oral traditions of modern hunter-gatherer tribes like the San, the Hadza, or the Aboriginal Australians. These groups, isolated for millennia, still tell stories at night, stories about the moon, about ancestors who turned into birds, about rules hidden in metaphors, And many of these stories share common themes: danger, memory, kindness, fear, love. In a world with no writing, stories that didn't serve a purpose simply vanished, so only the useful ones survived. And even they had to be sticky, rhythmic, strange, memorable. In a way, those fire circle stories were the first search engines. Type in "how to avoid a lion," and you might get a tale about a boy who bragged too loudly and a lion who listened carefully. Now consider the voice. There is no teacher, but there is a voice that speaks more often. It may be a woman with gray in her hair and a long scar down her shin, or a young man who once survived a flood no one else did. The community doesn't elect a leader of stories, it just listens more closely when certain people speak. What matters most is not power, but memory. Who remembers the most? Who tells it with the least fear? Who can keep the children still for an entire story? In time, that voice becomes a kind of anchor, mental map. It helps people remember not just what happened, but how to feel about it. Some stories become rituals. Each new moon, a tale is told, always the same one, about a child and a firefly, or a man and a stone he could not lift. At first, the tale has a purpose, maybe a warning about the tides. But over generations, the purpose fades. What remains is the rhythm, the familiarity, the comfort. Like a lullaby whose words no longer make sense, but whose melody still means sleep. In this way, stories become more than memory. They become identity. They answer quiet questions like, who are we? Where did we come from? Why are we still here? And sometimes, what happens when the fire goes out? Let's talk about that. The fire never lasted forever. Wood runs out. Rain falls. Accidents happen. One night, the fire dies early. The group sleeps cold and anxious. No stories are told. In the morning, voices are quieter, movements slower. Something unspoken is missing. Eventually, fire returns. But that gap, that one night without stories, is remembered. It becomes part of a larger tale. Even the absence of storytelling becomes a kind of story. And now you might wonder, did these early people dream differently? Did they sleep more deeply when the stories were rich and vivid? Did they wake remembering the voice from last night, trying to hum the rhythm again? And who was the first child to ask, "Tell it again, but make it different this time"? Chapter 2. Mammoth Bone Homes. Have you ever stared at a pile of bones and thought, this will be my house? Probably not. But someone, around 20,000 years ago, did exactly that. Somewhere on the open plains of what is now Ukraine, long before bricks, before wood frame beams, before clay tiles or copper nails, the wind howled across a frozen world. And the people who lived there did what people always do when the wind gets too sharp. They built something, not from trees. There weren't many trees, not from stone. Too heavy to drag, too cold to touch. They used what they had in abundance. Bones. Mammoth bones. Thigh bones, the size of a man. Tusks like arching doorways. Jaws still full of yellowed molars. Some from mammoths they hunted themselves. Others from animals already long dead. Their ivory half buried in permafrost. Their ribs poking from the ground like roots. This is not a story of kings or empires or war. It's a story of cold hands, scavenged bones, and the quiet determination to stay warm. Archaeologists have uncovered these homes, ring-shaped huts made from as many as 150 mammoth bones, arranged in circles and stacked with intention. The bones were not just heaped together, they were placed carefully, like puzzle pieces, with a logic that seems invisible to us now. A large pelvis might serve as a roof anchor. Rib bones, layered with hides, became wind blockers. Tusks leaned together into arches over doorways, forming entryways that curved like the backs of sleeping animals. Inside, they likely had fire pits, charcoal, ash, perhaps the smell of boiled marrow or burnt fat, and silence. So much silence you could hear snow falling on skin. Some of these homes lasted generations. Others may have collapsed in storms or under the weight of snow. But each one began the same way, with a question no one had asked before. What if we live inside what we used to fear? These shelters weren't only practical, they were deeply symbolic. To live in the bones of a mammoth was to say, we've survived it. We've turned the monster into a roof, and maybe that helped people sleep more deeply, not just from warmth, but from the comfort of triumph, however temporary you might think. Why not just use hides? And they did. Hides were draped over the bone frames, insulated with moss or grasses, but hides alone flap in wind. Bones held firm. Bones made memory visible. Every time someone entered, they saw the curve of a tusk and remembered how it got there. Some huts even included bones etched with markings. Were they calendars, symbols, primitive writing? We can't say for sure. But the presence of these marks tells us that this was more than shelter. It was a space for thought. Now picture this. A child sits beneath the dome of mammoth ribs, tracing her finger along the rough edge of a vertebra. Outside, the wind whistles. Inside, a story begins. Something about a hunter and a storm. Something her mother heard from her mother's mother. The bones are no longer just bones. They're the shape of survival. They are history pressed into architecture, and they were not exclusive to one place. Similar structures, made of mammoth remains, have been found across Central and Eastern Europe, from Poland to Russia. No blueprints, no shared written language, but the same idea, over and over. When you have nothing else, you use what is left behind. They didn't just build homes, they built belonging. Every bone tied them together, through hunger, through snow, through stories told by firelight. Now, imagine waking up in one of those homes. The walls don't creak, they groan, with age, with memory, with weight. You push aside a hide, step out into the cold, and look up. And somewhere in the sky, mammoth-shaped clouds drift above you like ghosts that approve. And you might wonder, did the bones creak differently depending on the wind? Did they start to believe mammoths protected them? Or did they know, even then, that shelter is always borrowed from something that once lived? Chapter 3. The first grandmother. Long before cities, or streets, or the idea of age itself, there was a woman. She was slower than the others. Her knees ached. Her teeth were worn down from years of chewing roots. But when she spoke, people listened. She wasn't the one who hunted. She didn't carry the meat back to camp. She didn't climb the ridge in search of dry wood. But she remembered where the berries grew last spring. She knew what the birds did just before the river flooded. And she had seen 3 winters more than anyone else in the group. This woman, the first grandmother, was not named in any book. No statue was built in her honor, but she changed everything. Not all animals have grandmothers. Most creatures don't live much longer than it takes to reproduce. But humans made a strange trade with time. We live longer. Even after we stop bearing children, we stick around to teach, to soothe, to remember. Anthropologists call it the grandmother hypothesis. The idea that our species began to thrive, not just survive, because of the old women who stayed. While younger adults hunted or foraged, grandmothers looked after the children. They passed down quiet wisdom. They carried history in their heads instead of baskets. The first grandmother likely lived around 40,000 years ago, somewhere beneath a canopy of trees, or among open grasslands near a stream. She may have had gray hair or none, wrinkled skin, yes, but also strong hands, good eyes. Her voice was not loud, but it never needed to be. She knew the look of poisonous plants. She recognized illness by the color of a child's breath. She may have even been the first person to hum a tune, not to entertain, but to calm a crying baby. And that baby, it wasn't hers. It was her daughter's or her sister's. But she held it anyway, because that's what grandmothers do, you might think. How do we know this? No one left a diary in the dirt. But fossil records tell a quiet story. In prehistoric skeletons, researchers have found older women with arthritis, with broken bones that healed, with teeth worn down to smooth edges. They weren't abandoned. They were cared for. That means they were valued. In places like the Shanidar Cave in Iraq, a 50,000-year-old Neanderthal woman was found buried with flowers. She was old, too old to hunt or carry wood. But someone laid her down gently. Someone marked her passing. And maybe that someone had once sat in her lap, listening to her hum. The first grandmother may have invented stories, not just memories of what happened, but why it happened. When the wind knocked down a shelter, she might have said it was the sky spirit asking us to move. Not because she believed it entirely, but because children needed a shape to fear and a reason to go. She didn't call it mythology. She didn't call it anything. She just made sense of the world, one word at a time. And those words, they lasted. A grandmother could carry generations in her voice. She became the archive, the guide, the bedtime storyteller when mothers were too tired to speak. And still, she asked for nothing, no credit, no place in the front of the line. She sat near the fire, listened, and when it was needed, she spoke. It makes you wonder, did the others know how rare she was? Did the children understand they were looking into the eyes of history? Or did they just know she made the nights feel safer? And one day, when her fire went out for the last time, did someone else move closer to where she used to sit? Chapter 4. Neanderthal Naps. They weren't so different from us, the Neanderthals. Shorter, stockier, quieter, but not the brutish caricature we once believed. Not stupid, not wild, just different. Around 400,000 to 40,000 years ago, they walked across what is now Europe and parts of Western Asia. Their days were cold. The Ice Age did not wait for comfort, but they endured. And at night they slept, not in houses, not with pillows, but tucked inside caves, wrapped in animal skins, pressed beside one another, chests rising and falling to the rhythm of ancient breath. Sleep was not a luxury, it was survival. If you did not sleep well, you could not hunt, could not run, could not watch for the big cats in the grass. But how did Neanderthals sleep? They had no alarm clocks, no digital blue light, but they had darkness. And that darkness told them when to rest. It wasn't perfect. They likely woke often to the sound of wind or dripping water, or something scratching outside the cave. They may have taken turns keeping watch. One eye always open, a hand always near the spear. Researchers found traces of grass and sedge in Neanderthal sleeping areas, bedding of a kind. Not soft, not decorative, but deliberate, arranged, placed for comfort. They also used fire, even indoors. A constant flame near the sleeping area. Warmth, yes, but more than that, light to ward off predators, smoke to keep insects away, and flicker, that flicker of flame on cave walls, dancing over drawings, over bones, over the tired faces of those just trying to rest. A Neanderthal nap wasn't deep REM sleep. It wasn't dreams of flying or running or falling. It was functional, it was brief, and it was everything. Their sleep patterns were likely segmented. A few hours after sunset, waking in the middle of the night, sitting by the fire, staring into the void, then drifting off again until the gray of morning. In the middle of those waking hours, maybe they whispered, maybe they touched hands, maybe they shared the day's last thought before silence. They didn't know they would vanish. They didn't know Homo sapiens would remain, but they left behind something curious, not tools, not weapons, but signs of care. Some skeletons show signs of disability, arthritis, injuries, missing limbs that had healed. That means someone helped. Someone let them rest while others worked. Someone tucked them in night after night, and you, lying in your bed today, might carry a little of their DNA, a memory in your bones, an echo of how they curled beside one another, close enough to feel breath on the back of a neck, safe enough to close their eyes. What did they dream of? We'll never know, but maybe, just maybe, they dreamed of us. Chapter 5. Digging and talking before there were books, before pens scratched across parchment, before anything was written down, there was only dirt and voices. Our ancestors did a lot of digging, with sticks, with stones, with hands calloused by centuries of repetition. They dug to survive, to bury, to find, to build, to hide. Digging was their library and their language, still young, still soft around the edges, barely there, but forming, welcome to the moment when hands and mouths worked together to make sense of the world, one whole at a time. Before we continue, tell us in the comments, what country are you watching from tonight? It helps our tribe grow, and if you haven't already, subscribe so we can keep unearthing the quiet corners of time together. Now, back to the dirt. They dug shallow pits for food storage, holes for shelter posts, fires to cook with, and sometimes, just because they wondered what was beneath, and as they dug, they talked, not fluently, not like us, but with rhythm, with gesture, with tone. Words were new tools. They didn't have grammar, no syntax, but they had sound, repetition, grunts shaped into meaning. Imagine this, you and your small band on the edge of a clearing. You dig with a stick, and when it breaks, you turn to your companion and grunt. Not just any grunt, a sound you've made before. The tool broke sound. They nod. They understand. Communication. We used to think language appeared like lightning, a sudden miracle, but it didn't. It rose out of boredom, necessity, daily repetition. Dig here, not that. Food there, come back. And slowly, sounds became signs, signs became words, words became memory. Some archaeologists believe the act of digging helped language evolve. Coordinated effort, shared goals, task delegation. You can't dig a deep pit without teamwork, and teamwork requires talk. Even today, in the oldest human settlements, we find digging sites, layered with time, each stratum like a whisper from the past. Stone chips, charcoal shells, tiny bones, all saying, "We lived here, we spoke here, we remembered." In one site in Jordan, researchers found thousands of flint fragments arranged in patterns, not just discarded, arranged, grouped. Why? No one knows, but perhaps someone was explaining something, a lesson, a story, a name. In this early world, you couldn't forget where you buried the food, or the child, or the dead. So you talked. You taught. You remembered together. And when storms came, when camps moved, you carried those words with you, like fire, like seeds. It wasn't glamorous. It was slow, uneven, filled with misunderstandings. But it worked. Because we're still talking. Every word you speak now, every sentence you type, is rooted in a hole dug long ago by someone who looked at the dirt and wanted someone else to understand why. What were the first words ever spoken? We'll never know. But maybe they sounded a lot like home. Chapter 6. Watching Shadows. They had no clocks, no watches, no schedules, no bells to ring the end of day, but they had shadows, and they watched them. Long before astronomy, before numbers, before temples and sundials and star charts, there was only a stick in the dirt and the slow crawl of its shadow. This was time. This was the first calendar. Tell us, what country are you watching from tonight? Drop it in the comments. We'd love to see how far these ancient shadows stretch. And if you're finding peace in this slow story, tap subscribe. We'll keep you company in the dark. The first people didn't just survive the night. They studied the day. They sat in stillness, watching the sun rise, move, fall, and in between, its light touched the world differently. Each hour with a color. Each moment with a meaning. A tree's shadow, once short and straight, grew long and thin, as if stretching its legs across the earth. Children played in it. Mothers called their children home when the shadow reached the fire. This wasn't science yet. It was rhythm, a habit of attention, a deep noticing, one that required no numbers, just patience. Somewhere, someone put a stick in the ground and noticed its shadow returned to the same place again and again. And from that, a shape of the year was born. Not exact, not measured, but enough. When the animals moved, when the roots were sweet, they could see the future, not in visions, but in repetition, in shadows that came back at night, the sun gone, the fire glowing. They would whisper about what the shadow had done that day, what it meant, what it warned. Some began to tell stories of gods who chased the sun, of great birds that pulled it across the sky, not because they were wrong, but because they needed meaning. And meaning moves faster than facts. The shadow gave shape to belief in Africa, in Asia, across the grasslands and deserts. These early humans tracked the sun not with tools, but with skin and sleep and memory. A child knew when it was time to return to camp, not because someone shouted, but because the world had changed color. The long red hour, the whispering hour, the time when light turns sideways and shadows lengthen into thought. Even today, you can feel it. Late afternoon, when your body softens, your thoughts drift, your voice lowers. You are remembering something ancient, because we didn't invent time. We noticed it. We didn't build it. We followed it. And the first bedtime stories, they weren't about war or kings or treasure. They were about light and its vanishing. What did we lose when we stopped watching shadows? Chapter 7. How we slept. We did not always sleep like this. In beds, in rooms, behind locked doors and ticking clocks. We used to sleep when the sky changed, when the birds grew silent, when the wind turned cool and the fire sank low. Sleep arrived, like fogs, slow, surrounding everything, and no one asked when or why. Before mattresses, before bedtime routines and electric light, sleep was different, wilder, looser, layered in pieces. If you're drifting off already, you're in good company, and if you're still here, tell us where you're listening from, somewhere on Earth, under the same old stars. Leave a comment and subscribe if you'd like, to keep traveling back with us, back to the original dreams. They called it segmented sleep, though of course, they didn't call it anything. They just did it. People slept in 2 parts, 2 sleeps, with a waking time in between. The first sleep began not long after sunset, when the fire faded and the stories ended. People lay in bundles of fur and straw, huddled near embers, listening to the wolves and the crack of wood cooling. That first sleep lasted 4 or 5 hours. Then came the waking hour, a quiet time, no chores, no noise, just thought. Some got up, checked on animals, rekindled the fire. Others stayed lying down, whispered to each other, prayed, dreamed awake. Then came the second sleep, deeper, slower, heavier than the first. This is when the real dreams came, the ones that felt like walking through smoke. It was not considered broken sleep. It was normal, balanced, resting in 2 halves, like breathing in and breathing out. And they didn't sleep alone. The modern idea of one person, one bed, one room, that was rare. Entire families, sometimes whole communities, slept in longhouses under shared roofs. They slept beside one another for warmth, protection, and peace. There were no alarms, only roosters, wind, the soft rustle of dawn. Dreams were serious. Dreams mattered. A dream could change a hunt or a marriage or a migration. Children were taught to remember their dreams, to carry them like seeds. The body was never punished for being tired. If you needed to rest, you rested. No caffeine, no shame, no schedule. Some cultures slept outside year-round, under skins, under sky. Others built sleep platforms in trees, far from insects and danger. They listened to frogs, to rustling, to their own breathing, and that was enough. Sleep was not a thing to conquer. It was a thing to join. In the Pacific Islands, people still nap together in hammocks strung between trees. In parts of Africa, midday sleep is still sacred. In ancient China, scholars wrote poems about the noon rest, where wisdom was found not in study, but in stillness. How we sleep now, is it better? We chase sleep, measure it, panic over it, treat it like a race to win. But once, sleep came gently, in cycles, in stories, in time with the wind. What would it feel like to return to that? Chapter 8. Wind was a god. Before language shaped gods into men, before statues and temples, before written prayers, there was wind. It came from nowhere and went where it pleased. It whispered before storms, screamed through canyons, sighed over the open plains. You couldn't see it, only feel it, and that made it terrifying and sacred. You're sitting in a clearing, your skin sticky with smoke, the fire low, the night wrapped around you like fur. Suddenly, the wind changes. No warning, no reason, just a shift. Someone older, someone with gray in their hair, stirs beside you and says nothing. They just watch the trees lean east. You follow their eyes, but you don't understand. Not yet. Somewhere in the shadows, an animal lifts its head. The silence breaks. The wind is speaking. Before gods had names, the wind had moods. It could be angry, joyful, curious, or absent. And, when it vanished for too long, people worried. There were no wind chimes then, no weather forecasts, only instinct, only repetition, only the careful listening of generations. It's easy to think they were guessing, projecting fear into the air. But they were tracking it, recording its patterns, long before calendars. They tied feathers to branches, hung bones on strings, used smoke to read direction. A column that bent south meant different things in spring than in winter. The shape of a fire's lean told them whether to hunt or stay hidden. If the wind blew from the high mountains, it carried news of ice. If it blew from the river, it might bring illness or fish. If it blew after sunset, they listened harder, because the wind didn't just tell the weather. It told stories. It told of distant fires, of herds moving across unseen valleys, of people coming or dying or never returning. And sometimes it lied. They gave it names, not like ours. No Zephyrus, no Boreas. They called it things, like She Who Knocks, or the breath from Bone Hill. In one group, a child born during a great wind would be named after its direction. Southborn, Northbringer, Wind-sister. In another, the elders would hold dried leaves in their palms and wait to see which way the wind lifted them. If the leaves dropped straight down, it meant the gods were asleep. They carved wind paths into stone, marked the direction of favored breezes, built shelters that leaned away from its fiercest moods. Some even believed the dead returned through the wind, riding it back from the mountain where bones were taken. Wind was breath, and breath was life, and life was always moving. Even in burial, they paid attention to the wind. Bodies were laid facing east or sometimes west, depending on which wind carried dreams. It wasn't mythology yet. It was survival. It was noticing. It was respect. Now, when wind howls past your window, you shut it out. You tape the glass. You scroll the radar. But once, you would have turned toward it, listening, waiting, asking nothing. Because when wind was a god, you didn't speak over it. You learned to hear it first, and maybe you still can. Chapter 9. Maps Without Borders. There were no compasses, no ink, no parchment, and certainly no borders. But people still knew where they were. They knew which tree roots always looked like claws, which hills dipped like sleeping backs, which stone piles hummed in summer. Their maps weren't drawn. They were remembered, sung, chanted, walked. These weren't places on paper. They were places in muscle, in memory, in repetition. A child might be taught the path to water by dancing it. Each turn, each landmark, a step in a rhythm. Turn left after the bird rock. Turn right where the wind smells like salt. Some groups carved notches in sticks, each nick a place, each bend a warning. Others painted lines on cave walls, not decorative, but directional. A spiral didn't mean eternity. It meant go around this hill. A handprint didn't say I was here. It said you are here. They had no names for continents, but they knew what lay 3 days east. A grove of tall grass that crackled underfoot. A stream that tasted like iron. A tree split by lightning but still alive. They didn't measure distance in miles. They measured it in effort. 3 songs away, 2 sleeps. A half-dash hunt migration wasn't wandering. It was memory in motion. It was ancestral GPS. You didn't need maps when you had stories. One tale might go past the place where the fire wouldn't start, before the place where the deer never sleep. After the bones of the tall man, there is the cave with warm air. And that was enough. The land spoke, and they listened. If a certain bird called before noon, rain came. If a moss patch dried up, the river had changed course. They mapped the sky to the stars, didn't form constellations. They formed roads. You could walk at night if you knew which stars to follow and when to stop. One group might follow the path of the moon. Another followed the way shadows fell at dawn. Others watched ants, watched how dust gathered in corners of caves. Everything meant something, and everyone learned to read. Not letters, but land. It's easy to think of them as lost, but we are the ones without direction. We need satellites, and still get turned around. They had no need for fences or flags. They didn't own land. They belonged to it. They didn't divide it. They memorized it. Imagine if you could walk your neighborhood blindfolded, not by sight, but by scent, by texture, by how your bones felt near the oak tree. That's what their maps were. Not lines, but layers of experience. And when someone died, a map died too. Unless it was passed down, in song, in walk, in whisper. Even trade routes weren't fixed. They bent like rivers, based on season, safety, story, and they always led back. Because a good map wasn't a path forward. It was a way home. So next time you unfold a paper map or tap a screen for directions, pause. What have you memorized? What would you remember if you had nothing to guide you but the wind, the stars, and your feet? Chapter 10. Before words. Before we could speak, we pointed, we grunted, we stared. But even then, we meant things. A raised eyebrow, a sudden stillness, a tilted head. These were our first poems. Words hadn't arrived, but meaning had. And in that long silence, thousands of years long, we still found ways to be understood. Think of a time when you stared at someone and they just knew before you said anything. That's what all of communication was before language. They didn't say danger, they tensed. They didn't say, follow me. They walked, then looked back, then walked again. A child didn't learn by listening. They learned by watching, copying, failing, trying again. Everything was body. Everything was gesture. A dance with no music, but all rhythm. You might think of this as a primitive life, but ask yourself, can you read a face in the dark? Can you sense fear in stillness? They could. They had to. Hunting required silence. Only the eyes spoke. A slight touch on the shoulder meant now. A frozen step meant wait. Even at night, the silence had shape. They could hear you breathe wrong. Know if it was fear, cold, pain, or hunger. They read emotion like we read text, fluently, without needing a single letter. But eventually, sounds took on patterns, not yet words, but hints. A click for fire, a hum for safe, a hiss for danger. Sounds with no alphabet, but full of agreement. Everyone knew what they meant, because everyone needed them. These proto-words, these first sounds, were not about self-expression. They were about survival. Only much later did we get to poetry, to love songs, to lies. But even then, words grew slowly, from need, from repetition, from pointing at something, then making a noise. Then someone else pointed and made the same noise. Then a third person heard and repeated it when the same thing happened. Suddenly, a word was born, but before that, silence ruled. A beautiful, sharp silence. Not empty, but full of meaning. We now fill silence with sound. But they filled sound with silence. And in the quiet, stories were still told, with a gesture, a reenactment, a dragged foot in the dirt. Even grief had its signs, a bent head, a slow walk, a refusal to eat. No one asked what's wrong. They just sat closer. There are languages today that still hold the echo of those times. Languages made from clicks and breath and pace. There are mothers today who understand their children before the first word is spoken, because the body still remembers the old communication, the pre-language, the human code. So next time someone says nothing, listen harder. Maybe they're saying more than words ever could. Chapter 11. Dreams and Rain. Rain didn't just fall. It arrived, like a guest, uninvited, but known. You heard it first, long before you felt it. The leaves shifted, the wind dropped, and someone in the group always looked up. They didn't say anything, just listened. Because rain wasn't only weather, it was memory. It brought things with it. It meant mud, it meant cold, but it also meant water, and water meant life. Sleep during the rains was different. It was lighter, more interrupted, but also deeper, more vivid, because that's when dreams came, not like ours, not full of clocks or phones or strangers at parties. Their dreams were the forest, but warped, the river, but flowing up, a deer, but speaking. Sometimes the sky fell into the fire, and when they woke, they remembered. They didn't have words for dream, but they had signs. You could tell. Someone woke slowly, stared at their hands, didn't eat. You knew they'd seen something, not in the forest, but inside. Dreams were not just stories. They were messages, warnings, answers. The group might not sleep in the open during rains. They'd huddle under a rock outcrop or lean branches together. It was cramped and wet still, but better than nothing. Children would sleep on backs or against chests, wrapped in furs that smelled of fire. You might be next to a cousin or not even know who the person was. It didn't matter. Rain meant closeness, breath, slowed in rhythm, bodies shared heat. The fire steamed and hissed. It never fully dried anything, but it comforted, and through it all, you'd hear the patter. The soft, endless tapping on leaves, on wood, on bone. The brain, unused to this endless sound, would drift, not to sleep yet, but to that in-between, where the dream world leaks into the real one. Some said they saw their dead in the rain. Others said they walked in rivers made of ash. No one laughed, not because they believed, but because they understood. A dream during the dry season was strange, but a dream during the rains, that was something else, that was worth remembering. Maybe someone had a dream that led them to a cave. Maybe someone dreamed of berries and found them the next day. Coincidence? No such word existed. A dream that helped you survive was true. That was the rule. And so the rains brought visions, not from gods, but from the deep self, the part of the human mind that still lived in trees, still ran from thunder, still feared the night. We have forgotten how much weather shapes the inner world. Now we hide from rain, watch it behind windows. But they didn't. They met it, breathed it, slept under it, and it changed them. So next time it rains, Don't shut the door. Listen. Something older than memory is speaking. Chapter 12. Stone Soup. They had nothing. No baskets, no pots, no bowls, no words for recipe. And yet they made soup, not the kind we know. No boiling water on a clean stove. No salt or garlic or bay leaves. Just a hole in the ground. A fire beside it and a few hot stones. You don't need a kitchen to feed people. Here's how it worked. Someone found a small pit, or dug one, lined it with animal skin or layered wet clay, filled it with water from the stream. Not clean, but good enough. They brought the stones from the fire, red and glowing, carried with long sticks or wrapped in bark, dropped them in the water. Hissing, crackling, steam rising like ghosts from the surface. Then came the scraps, a few roots, leftover meat, moss, sometimes insects, whatever could be spared. Nothing was wasted. The water boiled slowly, stone after stone, clouding, thickening, changing, and everyone waited, watched, smelled. Children were told stories as they waited. Why some plants were bitter, why the crow gave us fire, why bones must be broken before burned. Soup was not food, it was ritual. It was a way to stretch the last of what you had, to turn nearly nothing into something that felt warm, felt full, and it worked. For a few hours, you didn't feel the hunger as much. You stopped thinking about cold feet. You were part of a small miracle. But the strangest part was this. Sometimes they started with nothing. No meat, no root, just water and a stone. A smooth stone, special, chosen, not for heat, but for meaning. They'd drop it into the pot and say, "This is the stone that fed us before." And they'd begin to tell a story. Each person added what they could. A carrot, a beetle, a strip of dried meat, if they had it. But even if they didn't, they gave what mattered most, their presence, their listening, their silence. And the soup became full, not of food, but of memory, because that's the real reason for soup. To remember, to survive. So much of early human life was about turning empty into full, stone into warmth, mud into shelter, fire into story, and hunger into patience. Even now, in some quiet corners of the world, people still make soup this way. In silence, with smoke in their eyes, and children on their knees, waiting for something from nothing. A stone, still warm, sits at the bottom of the pot. No one eats it. No one questions it. It just stays. The last ingredient. The first memory. Chapter 13. Children of Mud. They were not born in hospitals, not under bright lights or buzzing machines, not wrapped in blankets with names stitched across. They came from mud and silence and fear and the steady hum of wind through grass. A baby in the age before names was not always a celebration. It was a risk, a wait, a question. Would it survive? Would there be enough food? Would the winter take it before its second moon? Still, they came. From women who squatted by riverbeds, holding onto tree roots, biting down on leather straps, whispering prayers that no god had written, their blood mixed with the soil. The cries were swallowed by the forest, and sometimes there was no cry at all. They smeared mud on their skin, not for beauty, but for warmth, to block insects, to soothe fever, to hide. Mud was the first cradle. It kept the sun away. It slowed down infection. It wrapped the newborn in something older than cloth, older than language, older than fire. There were no midwives, only older women, their faces heavy with lines, their hands steady from doing this before, too many times to count. They remembered which leaves to chew, which roots to press into, the belly which chanced to murmur while the body split itself apart. Babies didn't all look the same. Some were thin, eyes too wide, crying too long. Some were quiet, too quiet, wrapped in stillness, wrapped in waiting. Children weren't given names right away, not in every group. Sometimes not until they reached a certain age, 3 moons, a full year after their first injury, after they survived something. Until then, they were just the baby, or this one. Because to name was to hope, and hope was dangerous. Mothers didn't bond the way we think they did. Not always, not right away. They were cautious, distant, because loss was a constant visitor, and it came with no warning. But when a child lived, when it took its first step, when it laughed, real loud, ridiculous laughter, the camp changed. People noticed, smiled, even in silence. A baby's laughter was a kind of rebellion, proof that something small could live, even in all this darkness. Children played with mud, not toys, not books, just earth. They shaped little animals, poked holes, buried stones. They learned the world by feeling it. They did not go to school, but they were taught constantly what not to touch, what not to eat, how to throw, how to climb, how to run and still be quiet. And they watched everything, how fire was made, how the old men stared into it, how mothers bathed their wounds with spit and ash. Mud covered their knees, their faces, their hands, and still they played, because to be a child was to live in the in-between, between hope and hunger, between death and the next season. Mud was not filth, it was protection, it was camouflage, it was tradition. They didn't know they were children, they didn't know they were ancient, they just were. And when the first rain came, heavy, loud, sudden, they ran, screaming, laughing, their feet slapping the ground, mud flying in all directions. And for a moment, a small moment, the world wasn't hard or cruel. It was just wet and loud and alive. Chapter 14. When fire failed, fire was not always faithful, not always loyal, not always there. There were nights it simply vanished, leaving behind only smoke, cold ash, and the panic that followed. They didn't understand why, not at first. The wood was the same, the stones were the same, the breath, the rhythm, the ritual, all repeated, but still, sometimes, nothing. The spark refused to come. You have to understand, fire wasn't just heat. It was the difference between sleep and death, between cooked and raw, between warning and ambush, between a mother staying warm and a baby going still. When fire failed, people changed. They huddled closer, fought more, became shadows of themselves. Voices sharpened, hands tightened, trust melted. Fire meant structure, a center, a clock, a gathering point. Without it, the group splintered, each person alone with the cold, the dark, and the animals that moved in it, blaming each other, accusing softly. Someone didn't clean the pit, someone didn't feed it right, someone brought cursed wood. It sounds foolish now, but then it made sense, because nothing dies without a reason, not even fire. They watched the sky for signs, listened for cracks in the wind, felt the soil, anything to guess why the flame had abandoned them. Some said the fire spirit was insulted. Some said it was asleep. Some believed it was testing them. So they waited, wrapped in damp furs, breath clouding in front of them, bones aching. They waited. One night, an old woman, shaking, reached into the ashes with bare hands. She smeared the cold soot onto her arms, her chest, her face. She did not speak, just sat, waiting. They watched her, thinking she had lost her mind. But in the morning, as the sky turned a pale gray, she pointed to the east, said nothing, just pointed, and then a boy, just barely a boy, picked up the stones, tried again, and this time it sparked, a thin thread of orange, dancing, not enough, but alive. They fed it, gently, with breath, with broken bark, with twigs so small they snapped. At a whisper, it caught, and the group wept. Not like a funeral, but like a return. They fed it everything, wood, hair, even small bones, to show their gratitude, to make sure it would stay. The fire didn't care. It simply burned. But they did care, because this was control. This was warmth. This was the center. Again, from that night on, they changed. The way they treated fire, no longer a tool, it was a god, a guest, a creature that could choose to stay or leave. They left offerings, spoke softly around it, never blew on it too hard, never used green wood, never turned their backs while it was still waking when someone died. They fed the fire a piece of cloth or bark with the dead's scent still on it, so the fire would remember, so the warmth wouldn't fade. And still, sometimes it failed. No reason, no mistake, just gone. But now they had memory, and ritual, and stories. So when fire failed, they didn't break. They prepared. They sat in the cold, but they told each other it will return if we wait, if we listen, if we respect it. And maybe that was enough. Not to summon fire, but to survive without it. Because even in the dark, even in the cold, even in the stillness, they still had each other. And the promise that fire would come back, even if it didn't say when. Chapter 15. Borrowed Memories. They did not write, not yet, not even symbols scratched into stone. But still, they remembered. Memories passed, not through ink, but through mouths, eyes, scars. You didn't need to live something to know it. You just needed someone to tell it, right? And that was enough to make you believe you had seen it yourself. A fall from a cliff, a hunt that went wrong, a child who never woke up, all lived again inside those who only listened. This was how knowledge moved quietly from fire to fire, from tongue to ear. Borrowed memories. They called it wisdom, but it was more like layering. Each person carried a dozen lives, none of them their own, but all felt real. The boy who flinched at birds because someone told him a hawk once took a baby. The woman who never touched river reeds because her mother's mother whispered of leeches that drank too long. You are built like this, even now, with warnings you can't trace, fears that didn't start with you. Back then, there were no books, no scrolls, no cave etchings that explained, just breath and memory, and the belief that forgetting was dangerous, because forgetting meant repeating, and repeating could kill. So they memorized everything, not facts, but moments, patterns, odd things, which berries felt cold before tasting, which winds came before the herds, which animal eyes blinked slower before they charged. Children were trained without knowing it, not in drills, but in listening, sitting silently while someone older, someone shaking, told them what happened when a cave breathes steam, or when a tree weeps sap in winter. It wasn't poetic, it was practical. Memory was survival, and memory was shared. They repeated things exactly, same tone, same pauses, same mistakes. Even the errors were preserved, because maybe the error had meaning. Sometimes they passed down stories of people who never existed, but acted like they did. There was always a man who walked too far, a woman who ate something strange, a child who followed the wrong sound. Were they real? It didn't matter. The lesson was, you didn't need the truth. You needed the effect. Sometimes they said, we remember, so you don't have to learn. But that was a lie. Everyone had to learn. But with memory, you could learn slower, softer, with fewer dead. They didn't argue over details. They didn't care if it happened in one valley or another. They just wanted the danger to be clear and the pain to be useful. A memory was only as good as the scar it prevented. Old women were the best at remembering. They were the libraries, but they had no shelves, just silence. And that stare that told you what you should not forget. People came to them, not for comfort, but for a reminder, a borrowed fear, a shared mistake. And when the women died, people wept, not for their lives, but for what went with them. Unspoken things, untold warnings, lessons that would now have to be learned again, the hard way. No one ever said, I don't want to hear that story, because even if you'd heard it 100 times, you weren't hearing it for yourself. You were carrying it for the next person. That's how they lived, through others, and maybe that's how we still do. Maybe you've never seen a lion, but you flinch at shadows. Maybe you've never been alone in the snow, but you worry when the wind changes. Maybe the memory isn't yours, but it was given to you, a quiet gift, a whispered shield, and you carry it, even if you don't remember why. Chapter 16. The First Mourning. Someone did it first, before any language, before graves, before gods, before we even had names. Someone mourned. A body didn't move, and someone stayed longer than they had to, longer than was safe. That was mourning. The others moved on. That was survival, but one stayed behind. That was memory, not the kind that tells stories, but the kind that sits quietly, that waits by the bones. Not because the bones are useful, but because the person was mourning, wasn't invented. It happened, like fire, like fear, by accident, but it stayed. What did they feel? We don't know, but we see it in the hands. Hands found still holding other hands, fingers curled, like they were trying to keep something warm, even after warmth was gone. The first morning didn't look like ours. No flowers, no candles, no prayers, just silence and presence, and maybe a few stones placed nearby. We found them, burials from 100,000 years ago, bodies placed with care, sometimes with red ochre, sometimes curled like sleeping, not just dropped, placed that meant something. They didn't do it for show. They didn't do it for heaven. They did it for the person, because something inside said, this matters. Maybe it was the eyes, closed or open. Someone took the time to close them, or didn't, because they couldn't. Even animals feel absence, but humans do something more. They imagine the missing still watching. They speak to the air. They cry when no one is left to hear it. That is mourning. You could say it was weakness, but it made us strong. It slowed us down, made us careful, made us remember. Mourning taught us what not to take for granted. It turned people into stories, and stories into lessons. The first mourning didn't know about souls. didn't believe in judgment, just felt that something big had ended, and that it shouldn't go unnoticed. Later, we added rituals, ceremonies, songs, tombs, but the first one was just one person sitting beside another, not moving because they couldn't or wouldn't. Even now, in a hospital room or beside a phone, we repeat that moment. We freeze, we wait, we think this shouldn't have happened, or they were just here. That is the same. That first mourner had no words, so they stayed. That was their language. That was their goodbye. And then, eventually, they left, because they had to. And they carried that feeling with them, and maybe told someone, or maybe didn't. Maybe it was passed on without speaking, just in the way they touched or paused when someone didn't return. That is how mourning became memory. And memory became survival. We kept those who left by keeping them in us. You do that too, without trying. You think of someone, and for a second, they live again. That's not grief. That's what came after it. The quiet legacy. And it all started somewhere, with someone, beside someone, under a gray sky, in the cold, not speaking, just staying. Chapter 17, The Whisper Song. Not every story was told loudly. Some were meant to disappear as soon as they were heard, soft as breath, light as smoke. A whisper passed from one ear to another. That was the whisper song. Not a real song, not written, not even sung, but carried in voices just loud enough to cross the fire, just quiet enough not to wake a sleeping child. These were the songs not meant for the full group, but for one person, maybe two. Secrets, warnings, dreams too fragile for the open air. Why whisper? Because not everything should be said loudly. Because some truths lose their shape under weight. And because when you whisper, someone leans in to hear. The whisper song wasn't music, but it had rhythm, it had pauses, it had repetition, it stayed in the body, not just the mind. A grandmother leaning close, a friend beside your ear before sleep, a mother with her hand on your hair. Don't go near the red river, only eat the berries with spots. Never answer the owl after midnight. Truths, half-truths, wishes, fears, these were bedtime. Before bedtime existed, in a time before paper, before ink, before even drawing in the dirt, the only way to keep a memory was to keep a person, and the only way to make sure that person kept it was to say it quietly, so they would feel chosen, trusted, needed. You don't whisper what doesn't matter. And so these whispers survived, longer than screams, because screams fade fast, but whispers settle deep. Even now, you remember certain words, spoken once, so softly, but they stayed, because of who said them, because of when, in the caves, we found paintings, but they're not labeled. They don't explain themselves. Maybe they never were supposed to. Maybe someone sat with a child, pointed at the painting, and whispered. The real meaning, that whisper, is gone. The echo remains. Not every whisper was gentle. Some carried curses. Some carried warnings that curdled the air. But even those had power. More power than shouting. Because a whisper chooses you. It's intimacy that creates belief. You believed them because they were close, because they touched your shoulder, looked around, and then spoke. You listened, and you passed it on. Somewhere, long ago, a story was only told once, to one child, by one fire, and that child never forgot. Even if they forgot the words, they remembered the feeling that someone trusted them with something precious. That's the whisper song. It's in lullabies. It's in warnings before sleep. It's in the last words before parting. Soft, shaky, important. The first bedtime stories were not for everyone. They were for one, or maybe two, passed slowly, carefully, like a fragile spark, like a thought that could die if mishandled. Know what they said? But we know they said it because we still whisper. Even now, at funerals, at weddings, at bedsides, we lean in, we speak low, and we trust that it matters, and it does. Even if the words are forgotten, the moment stays. The closeness, the quiet, the breath, that was the first whisper song, and we've been singing it ever since. Chapter 18, Ice Sleepers. Cold doesn't forget. It remembers what warmth tried to erase. Ice wraps history slowly, preserving what time meant to rot. This is where the sleepers lay, not in beds, not in homes, but beneath frost, silent, still, and whole. Up in the mountains, where no one goes without a reason, where the wind has no master. There are bodies, not skeletons, not dust, but bodies, flesh sealed in snow, skin drawn tight like bark, eyes closed, sometimes open, as if still halfway through a thought. They didn't mean to sleep forever. They didn't choose that place. They just never left. The first ice sleepers weren't buried. They were caught by a storm, by a misstep, by a choice that should have gone right. And yet, in the freeze, they were remembered, not as names, but as form. What they wore, what they ate, how they braided their hair, a knife in a hand, a pack of dried meat, grass stuffed into shoes for warmth. No stories written, but their bodies told them all. Would you survive in the ice? What would you bring? How would you sleep, knowing you might not wake? They slept beside the sky. The clouds were their roof, the stone their bed, the frost their blanket, and no one found them, not for 1,000 years. But when they were found, everything stopped, because there, frozen mid-stride, was a human, just like you. Not a myth, not a symbol, a person, hair still in place, skin blackened from time, but still soft under gloves. He had tattoos, lines across his spine, marks of medicine, or pain, or faith. He had a story, but he never spoke it, so we guessed. We gave him names, we gave him causes, we gave him purposes, but he didn't ask for any of that. He just walked into snow and lay down, maybe for shelter, maybe for warmth, maybe to die with quiet. The mountain didn't care, but it kept him. Time passed, empires rose and fell beneath the ice. Languages changed, maps twisted, but the man didn't move, still curled, still holding his secrets. We called him CC. We took him from the ice. We studied his stomach, his wounds, his blood, and what did we find? He ate goat. He had bad knees. He was murdered. A clean arrowhead near his shoulder. Death in a blink. Life stolen before he saw the sky turn. But then the freeze came, and he became more than a man. He became a question. How many more are there? Sleeping where no one dares to. Step people we forgot, but the cold remembered. There were women too, children, old men with wooden canes. We found some curled up in Siberia, hair still braided, furs still wrapped around shoulders. A girl with beads around her neck, eyes wide open, mouth slightly parted, as if whispering a story before sleep took her. She had no name, but the beads mattered. Someone gave them to her. Someone cared. Even in the ice, these were not heroes, not kings, just people. caught in the wrong season, in the right place for memory. Because while warmth erases, cold remembers. Clothing, food, tools, lice in their hair, ash under their nails. Everything you leave behind, the ice holds gently. For centuries, you wonder, if you had to lie down now, in the snow, forever, what would you carry? What would someone read from your body 5,000 years from now? A ring, a scrap of paper, a charm, a message that meant everything once, and now means only that you were loved, or that you were scared, or that you were human. Sleep in ice is long, unbroken, without dreams, but full of stories, and so the mountain becomes a library, not of words, but of lives. Each drift a chapter, each body a book. The ice sleepers do not wake, but they wait, not for resurrection, not for meaning, just for someone to notice they were there. And now we have, and we will again, because ice remembers, even when we forget. Chapter 19, Stars That Spoke. You're not alone, you never were, not even when you were the only human awake in your camp, not even when the wind had died and the fire had gone out. Something was always watching. Above the world, above the clouds, above the storms, the stars were there. They didn't blink. They didn't move quickly. They didn't burn out. They just watched, and we watched them back. Before we had names for them, we had questions. Were they holes in a dark roof? Were they the fires of the gods? Were they eyes? They didn't speak in words, but they still spoke. Patterns, repeats, a dance in the sky. You, lying flat on your back, in a time before time, would have seen it too. The same stars, the same slow wheel, turning again and again. Somewhere in the silence, our ancestors realized the stars returned. Night after night, season after season, they came back. And that was memory. That was a calendar. They didn't have paper, but they had sky. You count the moons. You wait for the bear-shaped stars to rise. You watch Orion climb into the cold months. You know it's time to hunt, time to sleep, time to plant. The stars told you so, so you listened. You carved them into rock, into bone, into wood. You taught them to children. That one is the hunter. That one is the mother. That one tells us when the rains will come. These weren't constellations. They were promises. Some stars disappeared. They had names, too. Names we've lost. They meant something once. A death, a birth. But once, they meant survival. Imagine you, alone, fire low, your people sleeping. You look up. You see the Pleiades, 7 sisters, flickering just above the tree line. You know what that means. The cold is coming. You whisper it to yourself. You remember what your grandmother said. You wrap the children tighter. That's not science. That's survival. They built circles of stone, not for worship, but to follow the stars. Stonehenge, Nabta cairns lined up perfectly with the solstice. Not coincidence, knowledge, etched in boulders. They didn't read books. They read shadows, where it fell, when it stretched, what it meant. They knew when the star Sirius would rise just before the sun. They knew that flood would follow. They were ready. Egypt wasn't built on myths. It was built on starlight. Even sailors, thousands of miles from home, trusted Polaris more than a map, because it didn't lie, it didn't move. The sky told them which way was home, if they remembered how to read it. And we remembered. For a long time, we named the stars, mapped them, told stories about them, but we never owned them. because the stars spoke to everyone, all at once. The same sky over Africa, over Asia, over Europe, over you, shared by everyone, understood differently, and the messages were never loud, never urgent, just ... there, reassuring, cyclic, endless. And so we told stories, not to explain the stars, but to explain ourselves, why we felt small, why we kept looking up, why, even now, we still stare at the same old lights. You could be anyone, a farmer, a soldier, a child. You would still look up and feel it, that quiet, that watching. They say we are made of stardust, but maybe it's the other way around. Maybe the stars are made of us, our fears, our hopes, our sleep. They guided the lost. They tested the curious. They marked the nights. Even now, in cities drowned in light, you catch a glimpse and remember not who you are, but what you were. Someone who knew when to plant, when to run, when to wait, because the stars had whispered at first. What happens when we forget how to read them? When we no longer lie down and watch, but scroll and scroll? Do they still speak? Or have we gone deaf to old songs? That's the question, because the stars haven't moved. They're still up there, still spinning, still saying something. Are you still listening? Chapter 20. When we learned to write, we weren't supposed to remember everything, not with our heads, not forever. So we made marks, small at first, just scratches, not art, not language, just reminders. How many goats, how many sacks of grain, how many moons since the last flood. Memory, outside the body. Before this, you had to trust people, their stories, their voices, their promises. But people forget, people lie, people die. Marks don't. Those first lines weren't sentences. They were systems. Clay tokens in Sumer knotted chords in the Andes. Shell beads buried with the dead. Each one meant something to someone. Then came symbols. Someone realized that pictures could stand in for words. Not just what you saw, but what you meant. An eye didn't just mean eye. It meant watching, seeing, maybe even knowing. A bird meant sky, but also soul. A footprint meant journey, but also return. And once symbols were possible, stories became permanent. It wasn't fast. It wasn't clean. People scratched on turtle shells, pressed reeds into wet clay, cut lines into bone. Thousands of years of false starts. But then, somewhere in the dust came something new. Cuneiform, hieroglyphs, linear B. Scripts, not just signs, but sound. You could look at a mark and hear a voice. That's when it happened. That's when history began. Before this, everything was hearsay. After this, there were records, births, deaths, floods, kings, and not just the glorious ones. Also, tax receipts, boundary disputes, laws about fish, because writing wasn't made for poetry. It was made for grain. A temple had to know who owed what and when, so the scribes got to work. They sat for hours, in silence, carving symbols, line after line, row after row. They weren't writers, they were accountants, and their boredom gave us eternity. You sit now, reading a screen, but it's the same idea. You are looking at scratches, made by someone long gone, feeling their thought across time. That's what writing is, not magic, not invention, just a trick to make memory travel. We wrote to remember, then we wrote to control, then we wrote to dream. After the farmers and the priests came the poets, the dreamers, the keepers of what mattered. They wrote songs, eulogies, epic lists of what had been. Gilgamesh, scrawled on clay tablets, the oldest bedtime story we have. He was a king. He lost his friend. He looked for answers. It's boring. It's beautiful. Because it's us. The fear of forgetting. The ache of remembering. The joy of seeing something last. That's why we wrote. We wrote to survive winter, to count sheep, to tell the gods we were listening. But we also wrote for this moment, right here. You, alone, still awake, reading words written by someone you don't know, in a voice you can't hear, but somehow it feels familiar. Because writing isn't sound, it's echo, and echo doesn't need a body. The first written words weren't shouted, they were whispered, etched carefully, for no one in particular, and yet here you are, hearing them, long after the ink dried, long after the stylus cracked, long after the author died. You are the reader they never met, and that makes you part of the story. So next time you sign your name or scratch a list on the back of a receipt, remember this: you're doing something ancient, something holy, something born in boredom. And maybe, just maybe, you're writing for someone else. 1,000 years from now, still awake, still listening, still trying to remember. Thank you for staying awake through all 20 chapters of the boring history for sleep, the very first bedtime stories ever told. If this gave you rest or stirred a quiet curiosity, leave a comment below with where you're watching from, and let the stories continue in your dreams.